Welcome back. This is part two of the lecture on the late Baroque all the way to the art of the Age of Enlightenment. And when we last left off, we just were about to talk about Andrea Pazzo, who is a very important artist, both because he helped kind of establish one of the main things about High Baroque and late Baroque art was this interest in decorative religious painting in churches where it's illusionistic, it's kind of trompe l'oeil, where it's an extension of the architecture of the building into often these very elaborate kind of atmospheric sky sort of ceiling murals. And if you remember when we were talking about architecture, I talked about how in Baroque architecture, there was like a new version of the Gothic in some ways, in that the Gothic was very much about on the interior, not talking about the transfer of weight, but aiming for weightlessness, for the sense of the building to just rise up as if it's rising up to heaven. And then in the Baroque, we have a much more literalist version of that, where the buildings really literally become like gateways to this pictorial heaven above us, such as here. And Pazzo was also very influential in using trompe l'oeil effects. Like this right here, this oculus dome is actually painted. It doesn't really exist. It's actually flat. But from certain angles in the church, it looks perfectly three-dimensionally going up into space. And he was very much kind of at the forefront of doing that in churches and kind of arguing for that being an interesting, and he even wrote a book about it. So he was very influential, even though he was a monk, and so he didn't do a lot of painting. Being a man who worked for the church, he had administrative duties as well. But he was extremely influential on the late Baroque into the Rococo, and really we wouldn't have. I don't feel like we'd have the career of someone like Tiepolo if it hadn't been for Pazzo. So, and Tiepolo is one of my favorite artists of all time, and we'll talk just a little bit about him later in terms of how his artwork here, which is a continuation of that trend from Pazzo, is also in some ways kind of like the international version of the Rococo, the Italian and international kind of version. But we'll get to that. Before we get to the Rococo, we have to go a little bit back in time and to France, and we have to talk about Poussin. And so Poussin is pretty much a contemporary of Rubens, a little bit younger than Rubens, contemporary of Velázquez, somewhat of a contemporary of Vermeer and Rembrandt. And so, here we're looking at the very beginning of his career, the first time he went to Rome and making paintings. And in the beginning of his career, his paintings are quite loose and kind of transparent, very kind of gesture based, and he's somewhat influenced by Carracci, but he's aiming for something a little bit more, like I said, a little bit more loose and transparent in his manner. But as his career develops, he becomes more conservative. I don't know about his political point of views, but more conservative about his views about art. His paintings become much more about hard edge line drawing, and then the paintings really holding crisply and kind of flatly to those hard edges. And there's less kind of movement and gesture in the paintings, and much more kind of a solemn, serious quality to them. Here we have a religious painting by Poussin, and here's a famous example, so we all know this one. So we kind of see his transition from 1627 to 1634. There's already, in this is a very short period of time, he's already kind of becoming a tighter and more kind of academic and more, but also a more serious focused painter, a painter who believes that paintings should be about serious issues. And one of the things also that's interesting is, you may notice there have not been very many religious paintings in this lecture. It's not that there aren't many made. There still are quite a lot of religious paintings, but one of the things that's developing is more interest in other topics for paintings, whether it's historical allegories and mythological allegories, and other just topics for paintings. So in response to that kind of that move in French painting towards this more tight, more drawing based and more hard edged and more academic kind of feeling in painting, we have a certain point, um, a little bit of we have kind of a pushback to that. And that becomes, at first, that is really just the work of Antoine Watteau, but it becomes the Rococo, that he, as a one-man kind of aesthetic force, changes people's tastes dramatically, where he starts pushing this idea that painting should be much more transparent, and much thinner and looser, much more about mark making, and much more gestural, and that the compositions should be more open and loose and less kind of strictly tied to the structure of the page, less strictly geometric, and also an interest in subject matter that's less overwhelmingly serious, subject matter that's more about pleasure and more playful. Now, Watteau's career is not just um, those Cythera paintings, and there's lots that he did, and he was an amazing artist in so many ways. One of the great figure draftsmen of all time, and just one of the great painters of all time. And but in the art history books, he's mostly noted for his influence on the more extreme trends of the Rococo. So just remember, he actually, I should include in his lecture, he did some very serious academic religious paintings as well. So every artist is more than just the highlights, more than just the works that they're really well known for. But the Rococo does continue, and the influence of Watteau becomes much more about this push towards art that is about pleasure, and about kind of a loose, quick, gestural way of painting, and not about these kind of extremely serious and formal kind of compositions, talking about serious, formal, historical, and religious issues. Um, and so we have paintings like this. Fragonard is also one of my favorite painters. Um, just an amazing painter, and he uses so much white, but I forgive him for it. Um, and and such a beautiful hand. I mean, like, look at the way he puts these marks and the layering of these different transparent marks right there. Um, so But whenever there is one trend, and just for a moment, since we're talking about the Rococo, think about then how these paintings are in some ways kind of a reflection of those aesthetics, but doing it in a more kind of um, a more a way that's more acceptable to the overall powers that be, and especially to the religious powers of the Catholic Church. Um, and so Tiepolo becomes kind of a international and a Italian kind of version of the Rococo, or at least an adoption of some of the aesthetics of the Rococo. But there is also, there eventually in France, there is a reaction to that, to the Rococo, and to especially what is seen as the especially over frivolous quality of the Rococo. And that, once again, is started by pretty much the work of one man, in this case, Jacques-Louis David. And that's pronounced David because it's French, not English. And so Jacques-Louis David is also one of the great painters. And we've seen, hold on a second, kind of pause. That's my 1 minute warning. Um, and we've seen this painting before, and we have seen the Death of Marat before. I have them in kind of reverse chronological order, but they're here to kind of represent that kind of range of David's career from the beginning to the end. And I'm not that it's that much of a range of time, but the main thing that kind of ties all of his work together is kind of he has this interest in, like Poussin, interest in historical, especially classical historical. Ooh, I should probably end there. I'll get back to you on David in just a